Hello and welcome to the Homeless Consultant channel. My name is Paul B. I am the Homeless Consultant. And for those of you who watched the previous episode of this series about our abysmal education system in the United States of America, you may have noticed that I did a quick change of costume here. Well, actually what happened, if you watched that video, you actually got to see how one of these school bus drivers was stalking me, which happens to me all the time. I went over that in videos way back when. So I moved my car from one side of the park all the way to the other side, to the other parking lot, to do this video, and can you guess what happened? That driver started up his school bus and followed me into that parking lot. So I'm doing this one on a different day. If you have not watched my video called The 50 Greatest Existential Threats to the United States of America, please do so. What this video is going to go in detail on number 5, the student loan racketeering industry. And this is a case, this is one of the episodes in this series where I honestly don't even know where to begin or how to end it, because there's so much to talk about and it's not being talked about at all in the mass media. So let's put these on. When Donald Trump took office, one of the first things he did was put Betsy DeVos in charge of the U.S. Department of Education. And again, the previous video I talk about the U.S. Department of Education, how it is nothing more than a slave and a servant to the student loan industry, and the mechanism for dumbing down our education. Thank you, Jimmy Carter. That was one of his gifts to us, Department of Education. Betsy DeVos is married to Dick DeVos, one of the founders of Amway. And I happen to be quite familiar with that family and that group. No matter what you think of Amway, and I've never been a fan, I'll just come out and say it, but no matter what you think of Amway, if you understand how Amway works, you know, it's kind of a Egyptian style business model, if you know what I mean. Despite that fact, let me make another proposition to you. Let me play Tony Robbins for a moment, or one of these other, money-making gurus, and come up to you and say, I have got the deal of a century for you. I can get you in on the ground floor of the biggest money-making bonanza of the late 20th century. I can get you living in a one-bedroom apartment right now? Are you having trouble feeding your kids? I can get you in on the ground floor of the best opportunity you will ever find in your entire life. What is it? I'll tell you about it. Low interest, high risk loans. Now, if you went through our American education system, you probably didn't even understand what I just said, and that's a shame, because you should have gotten it right away. As much as I do not like Amway's business model, I will say this much. Dick DeVos would have understood exactly what I said the moment it came out of my mouth. Low interest, high risk loans being a money-making bonanza. Low interest means that when you borrow money, you pay very little back along with the principal. So in other words, you make very little money off of it to begin with. High risk means that the odds of you getting paid back anything are much worse than in a low-risk investment. So in other words, there's not a whole heck of a lot of chance that you're going to get paid back, and if you do get paid back, you're only going to get paid back a little bit. You see, I was being facetious there when I said it's a money-making bonanza. That is a recipe for disaster. Anyone who goes into a business like that is courting bankruptcy. They're going to spend every day, they're going to wake up in the morning, put on their suit, comb their hair, they're going to grab a baseball bat and a shotgun, and they're going to go out and they're just going to do battle with bankruptcy all day long. And they're going to come home just beaten and bloodied and torn. Low interest, high risk loans has to be the stupidest business model. Only government could come up with something like that as an investment. And that's exactly what they did. Student loans originally were quasi-government. What that means, look it up. I'm not going to go into this. But originally, when student loans came out, they were meant to provide funds for people who cannot afford a college education. Now, why can they not afford a college education? Well, you know, there's this fella in Minnesota, this kind of I call him a likable crackpot. You know, like half of his research is phenomenal, interesting, fascinating stuff. The other half is just lunacy, conspiracy theory, stuff like that. On this side of it, one of the things he claims is that back in around 1970 or so, college administrators figured out that, you know, after World War II, this country was so prosperous that so many American families had either paid off their homes or they built up a lot of equity in their homes. So his theory is that college administrators saw this and they said, they've got a whole bunch of money tied up in their homes. They want their kids to have a college education so that they can have a better life than they did. I bet you if we raise tuition, they'll find a way to pay that tuition, even if it means selling their home or getting a second mortgage. And his claim is that tuition rose because of that. Now, in theory, that does obey the law of supply and demand. In theory. There's a couple problems with it, though. First and foremost is that college administrators aren't that smart, for one thing. They're not necessarily that devious or reckless, and that is, to me, it crosses the border into a conspiracy theory. I need some more evidence that something like that happened. I don't see where that happened. It's not to say there wasn't an administrator at this school or that school who might have had that enter his noggin, but I don't think that's the reason why tuition rose. Because if you look at the numbers, but the principle is correct. The principle is the law of supply and demand. If the supply of money for paying for college education increases, then they're going to raise the price of the college education because now people can pay it. You see, when a free market is left alone and say, oh, the government, for example, does not get involved, there's an equilibrium reached. For the educators to stay in business, to keep their jobs, they have to do a couple of things. For one thing, they have to charge a fair price that all the people over here can afford to pay. And there will be these ups and downs, and if you get to Harvard, there's going to be this, but then again, the people going to Harvard earn that much. But you've got this kind of thing going on. There's an equilibrium. That's a free market. And what happened was the government came in and said, well, we want more people to go to school, so we're just going to make free money available. Now, it isn't free, it's low interest, but you get it as a check. It's free money in the here and now, instant gratification. So you've got the schools who are charging a stable tuition, people who can afford a certain amount, and everything's fine. These people have job security. They're able to, these people can buy this product. Well, once the student loans came along, all of a sudden the amount of money that these people had to spend started to rival, you know, the people who were going to Harvard. So what happened? Of course, supply and demand. All of the colleges raised their tuition to consume that extra money because the money was allocated supposedly for education, student loans. Now, when you bring, you know, so it goes like this, and if you bring that down and you go to Harvard, it's like, well, you'd say, well, can't the average person afford to go to Harvard now? No. No. Because, you know, first of all, there's eligibility requirements, but no matter, Harvard would raise theirs, Cornell, Yale, they would all raise theirs accordingly. So nothing changes in that regard in particular. Maybe a little bit here and there, individuals could go to Harvard who couldn't before. For what it's worth, the only impact that student loans had, it allowed more people to go to college, and it jacked up the price of college education tremendously. Then everyone followed along with it. All the support industries for schools, textbooks. When I was in school, I was paying, $150 for a textbook. A textbook. You know, a book the size of this one, for example. Just a thin little book. $150. That was unheard of in 1970. It was impossible. The law of supply and demand did not allow it. But once you gave people all this money with student loans, there you go. Now the premise was that we're going to offer you low interest student loans. So when you get out of college, you're quote, not going to have any problem paying this back because, you know, getting a college education guarantees you a job, right? Right? I'll just let you stew on that one for a second. Right? Low interest. Who are they giving the loans to? By definition, people who do not yet have an education. The product is an education. By definition, the debtor has no education. Almost by definition, for the same reason. They have no life experience. They have no work history. They have no history of responsible adulthood. They're young people. They're young adults. Fresh out of high school. Fresh off the boat, you might call them. In terms of going from childhood to adulthood. And the government comes along and says, we're going to give you thousands of dollars in free, well, not quite free, but for now it's free. You know, you'll have to pay a bit more later, but now you can go to college, and then you could have that great life that your parents could never have. You know, it seems to me that parents had a pretty good life. As I said in the very beginning, they were paying off their houses, they had all this equity built up. Things seem to be going pretty well for them, actually. But that's the government for you. If it ain't broke, fix it anyway. Well, so as you infused all this cash into the education system, you made the supply so much higher through student loans, the cost of education, everything, not just tuition, everything. And as tuition goes up, the unions go into overdrive and start demanding higher salaries for college professors. It changes the whole dynamic of everything. That equilibrium that the free market gave us is completely annihilated. Just boom! Exploded to smithereens. And from 1970 onward, that's what we saw. And it had devastated, and then in, I think it was 79, when Mr. Carter gave us the Department of Education. One of the greatest disasters in American government history. So, yeah, 79, 80. It was 13 years later, 1993, when the government decided to privatize the student loan industry. 1993. And almost immediately, it became a complete disaster. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about Sallie Mae in this discussion. It is not just Sallie Mae, but Sallie Mae is so much the largest perpetrator of this crime. They are by far the largest student loan servicer. They are the ones who took this privatization and turned it into a racket. And I should mention what a racket is first, because we're going to see this in a lot of these episodes. A racket is when one person or one entity controls both the supply and the demand. That's the definition I tend to use. And the classic example is Rocco walks in, you've got your store, your little laundromat, your family-run laundromat, everything's fine, no problems, feeding your family, have a good business. Rocco walks in one day, enters your life, watch my video, The Sum of All Degeneracy. Some stranger enters your life and turns it upside down. He's got a baseball bat, he's got a can of gasoline, and you can see a book of matches in his pocket. He walks in and he says, you know, I'd really hate to see something bad happen to this place. There's been, you know, people starting fires around here lately. If you pay me some money, I'll protect you to make sure your place doesn't burn down. See, what Rocco's doing is he's providing both the supply and the demand. Okay, he's creating the demand by creating the threat of burning the place down, whether he says so or not. You don't have to say something for it to be a very real threat, mortal threat. He's creating the supply by offering, if you give him money, to protect you from that threat that didn't exist before Rocco walked in your door. That's a racket, and that's why it's a criminal activity. That's why in a legitimate government it is dealt with very, very harshly, because it's a form of human slavery. There is absolutely nothing the individual can do. It's a no-win situation. It puts them into a catch-22 situation. They have nothing left but Hobson's choices. They can't win. And it's all because some third party decided to enter their life and to turn everything upside down. Racketeering, to me, is one of the very, very worst crimes. It should be, personally, I think it should be a capital offense, but at the very least, anyone who engages in racketeering should never be allowed to enter public ever again. They should be locked in a cell until the day they die. That's how bad racketeering is. It is a form of human slavery. So let's go back to Sallie Mae. Sallie Mae could have gone any number of directions, and so could all these other student loan companies when the student loan industry was privatized. But Sallie Mae made a conscious decision to go the racketeering route. Sallie Mae's CEO, if you can believe it, if you can even believe this, his name was Al Lord. You can't make this stuff up, folks. Here's what happened with the student loan industry. At the time, and this is about the time I was in graduate school when this happened. So there was no communication to me when I got my student loans. You walked in, they put a piece of paper in front of you, and they said, here you go, just sign that, we'll cut you a check. They never said a word about what the details were. They never asked you if you wanted to read it. They never asked you to get an attorney to read it. They never told you anything. And in particular, they never ever told you two things in particular. They never told you what the potential consequences were of signing your name there. Let's say you sign this loan agreement, you have every desire in the world to pay it back, but you lose both your legs in a car accident as soon as you graduate from medical school, and you can't work as a doctor anymore. They don't tell you what the consequences are, that you're going to end up living in a garbage can in Los Angeles. They don't tell you that, because of the student loan industry's vicious terrorist collection tactics. They don't tell you that, and there's no legal obligation for them to tell you that. It doesn't matter if you want to pay it back. What matters is, do you pay it back? And that's not in your control, is it? It never was in your control. That's why taking on debt is fundamentally irresponsible and extremely risky. And remember, people who have no history of professional work, they don't have an education, they don't have life experience, extraordinarily high risk to begin with. We're not talking about someone who's been in business, successful business person for 30 years who goes out and gets a loan. There's at least a reasonable expectation that this person can handle that responsibly. That they can, make accommodations for, all different possible outcomes to make sure that that gets paid back. And it doesn't always happen. Sometimes they have to go into bankruptcy as well. But the odds are much better with an experienced business person than an 18-year-old and one-day-old kid who's signing their name to a document that the student loan industry, which is to say the colleges themselves, the student loan departments in the colleges, do not even require them to read the document before they sign it, let alone understand anything in it. That's the first thing that went haywire. The second thing that went haywire was that there was no obligation to tell these students that no matter what the rules are today, it doesn't matter. You're going to be bound by what the rules are in the future. So let's say just for hypothetically, let's say the student loan industry becomes the most corrupt so-called legitimate industry in America over the next 10 years. It becomes something that they should be building brand new prisons to house the people responsible for this. It's so bad. It's going to destroy generations of Americans. It's going to be an existential threat to the United States of America. Let's say that happens over the next 10 years. You're going to be bound by their rules when that time comes. There's no obligation for the student loan industry, for the schools, for the banks, for anyone to tell these 18-year-old kids who are signing their names, or 20 or 23-year-old kids, there's no obligation to tell them, by the way, no matter what you think you know today, it doesn't matter, because they can change the rules on you and you're going to be stuck. So countless, tens, hundreds of thousands of students signed their names, didn't read it, they couldn't afford an attorney anyway, a competent attorney, and even if they could, what's the attorney going to say? You ever try to get an attorney to explain a contract to you? Half of them don't even understand what they're doing. That's not the most competent industry out there, law. Okay? So these students who are 18 years old, understand, the day before, but when they went to bed, they could not legally sign any legal agreement. 8 hours later, they wake up from bed. They get out of bed before their parents even have a chance to say happy birthday. They can go out and get credit cards. They can get student loans just by signing their name. 8 hours later, all of a sudden, they can have the entire rest of their lives bound by those agreements. And when it comes to student loans, that is exactly what happens. Led by the Lord, and I don't mean the good one, Sallie Mae decided to take the now privatizing student loan industry in the racketeering direction. What does that mean? When I did, remember I spent 4 years researching and writing that book on information gathering, sales, etc. Now, the first installment of that was related to the credit reporting industry in particular, so it got into credit cards. One of the things I discovered there was, at least at that time, the credit card companies actually made the most money when a certain percentage of their customers defaulted. Sounds counterintuitive, but it's supply and demand. They could charge fees, they could raise interest rates, etc. But you can't do it to too many people, because then the people can't pay back anything. But in terms of you actually getting money, and at the time it was around 7 point something percent. If 7% of the people with these credit cards defaulted, the card company would make the most money. And that number is going to change with other circumstances. It's no different for the student loan industry, except for a couple of things. One of the things they did toward racketeering was, student loan industry is the only form of consumer debt that has no standard consumer protections whatsoever. Everything that you have with credit cards, home loans, car loans, out the window, gone. You don't have it with a student loan. And remember, student loans are by definition signed by people who woke up very recently at the fresh age of 18. Even if they're 23, they're still not old enough or experienced enough to know what they're doing, what they're getting into. So the student loan industry, led by Sallie Mae, they found that there's a lot of things going on here. Back then they had, probably today, what they call guaranteed student loans. Okay, now let's say you get a car loan and you're 18 years old. I mean, no one's going to let you sign for a loan like that yourself. When you're 18 years old, no work history, nothing. No job probably, not working at McDonald's. You get a co-signer. So let's say your parent signs for the car. You default, you can't pay the bills. They go after the co-signer. So let's say your parent pays off the car. Okay? Now you've got some pretty black marks on your credit history, but the car's been paid off. They don't come after you to pay it a second time. The co-signer took care of it. With a guaranteed student loan, the government guarantees the loan. So these banks will give out, or more than happy to give. Why shouldn't they give out a student loan? It's guaranteed by the government. If the debtor defaults, the government pays them the money. But here's the catch. After the government pays them the money, they can go out and collect it anyway. A second time. Can you guess what Sallie Mae did? They went out and bought a bunch of collection agencies. So now they're not only in the student loan industry, but they're also in the collections end. So if a student defaults on their debt, Sallie Mae gets paid by the government who guaranteed the loan, and then they get to go out and collect on it a second time using their collection agencies who are not bound by any standard consumer protections. Which means they can literally terrorize not only the debtor, but their family, their co-workers. They can do anything they want. Because by definition, a struggling debtor cannot afford the kind of legal representation needed to put a stop to that terrorism. Six years later, 1999, Forbes magazine rated Sallie Mae, and you'll forgive me, I've been in my car for 5 years, all my research, I'm doing all this by memory at this point. All my research is filed, packed away. Forbes magazine listed Sallie Mae either as the most profitable company in the United States of America, or it was among like the top 5. I think it was the most profitable company in the United States of America. Let me remind you what their business model supposedly is on paper, according to the government. Low interest, high risk loans. Remember the shotgun, the baseball bat, fighting against bankruptcy all day? That's what low interest, high risk loans will get you. It's the stupidest business you could ever go into if you want to feed your family. It's a recipe for you going insane and killing yourself in frustration. And yet, Sallie Mae somehow in that industry became, in 6 years, became the most profitable company in America. How's that possible? I'll let you mull on that for a moment while I take another sip. How is that possible? Actually, Al Lord told us how it's possible. In one of his annual reports for Sallie Mae at that time, it says so right in the annual report to the shareholders. Most of our income came from, I don't have my drumsticks in the car. Most of our income came from fees. Fees, not people who took out a loan paying back their loans on time, on schedule, in full. Fees. If you pay back your loan on time, on schedule, you don't get any fees, do you? There might be a servicing fee that's built in from the beginning. You should have been told that when you signed the agreement. Where do those fees come from? Well, and again, I'm going to refer you to this book, Student Loan Scam. This is by Alan Collins, who, to me, is one of those American heroes who should be honored by the President of the United States. He has made such a monumental effort to reach leaders in government, to explain this to them, and they just don't get it because our leaders aren't that smart. Remember the previous episode of this, our poor education system. Our leaders don't get it. Some of them are so corrupt that they're a part of this system. For example, Speaker of the House John Boehner back then, his daughter worked for Sallie Mae. What do you think Boehner's going to do to hurt Sallie Mae? Not a lot. For example, the U.S. Department of Education. People go to work at the U.S. Department of Education and earn a civil servant salary. Doing what? I don't know, because they don't do anything except serve the student loan industry. But if you do that well, if you demonstrate that you are willing to live in complete obedience to this student loan industry, there's a very good chance the student loan industry is going to hire you out of there at a job that pays 2-3 times as much. Overnight, you're making 2 or 3 times as much money as you did before, basically doing the same thing, serving the student loan industry. Not students, the student loan industry. Meanwhile, people who work in these student loan industries, private, because it's been privatized since 1993, these private companies, for some reason they decide, well, I don't like making $50,000 a year. I'd rather make $30,000 a year. I'm going to quit this job and go work at the U.S. Department of Education. You know, what I've been working in is a financial industry, but all of a sudden I care about students' education. I'm going to go work at the Department of Education and take a massive pay cut, as if my legs have been cut off. Why would they do that? Because once they're inside the U.S. Department of Education, they're still serving the student loan industry. It's called a revolving door, and you will see this in almost every government regulatory agency. The FTC, the FAA, the FCC, the Department of Education. You will see it, the Department of Health, for heaven's sakes. You talk about a symbiotic relationship between pharmacy, big pharmacy, and the Department of Health. That's fascism right there. Department of Education and the student loan industry are indistinguishable. But when the student loan industry got that kind of symbiotic relationship with the U.S. Department of Education, all of a sudden, even though it's now a private industry, it carries the full weight and authority and power of the U.S. government. Did you know that the United States Department of Education has its own paramilitary force. Did you know that? Because the news isn't telling you that, are they? Is Care 11 here in Minnesota, the ones who won't talk a word about my situation, are they telling you that? You see, as a government agency, the U.S. Department of Education can call in U.S. Marshals. U.S. Marshals are like the, jack of all trades. If someone in government needs you to go out and kick down someone's door, shoot the dog, stick a machine gun in their children's head while they're sleeping in bed, you call in a marshal. The Department of Education, as a U.S. government agency, can do that, and they have done that. They have gone to student loan debtors' doors, knocked it down, gone in with the guns ablaze, or not ablazing necessarily, but going in with the guns pointed right at them, Soviet style. That's the U.S. Department of Education who is ultimately commanding that paramilitary force. Does that make any rational sense to anyone out there in terms of education? This is not about education, and it never was. This is a racket. It is a criminal racket. There's a reason why books like this are written. Alan runs a website called Student Loan Justice. Thousands of stories of people who had their lives completely destroyed by student loans. By the student loan industry, I should say. Because, again, the student loan industry makes more money when you default on your loans than they do when you pay it off on time. There are a lot of people out there who have been able to pay it off on time. They're the lucky ones. They had a family support, they got a good job out of college, and they paid their loans off on time. They don't even comprehend that there's a problem here. They don't even comprehend it. And quite often, when you go to forums like Student Loan Justice and you go to places like that, you'll find people who, for some reason, they decided to take time out of their lives to go from one forum to another over an extended period, like years. And they decided to go into these forums where people are talking about how their entire lives were destroyed. Their marriage was destroyed by this. Their child committed suicide because of this. Their child moved to the Philippines and they'll never see them again because they're terrified. They're absolutely terrified of the Department of Education sending a paramilitary force to their family's door. These kinds of stories going on. And these people who for years can just go around and troll all these websites. They go in there and say, well, I had no problem paying off my loans. What's wrong with you, you irresponsible bum? This is a tactic that anti-smokers used, because one of the first forums on Usenet, way back at the beginning of the public internet, before the web, before they even had mouse clicking and everything, smokers were one of the first ones to gather in that environment. These anti-smoker lunatics came in there and they started trolling the place. And back then you could trace them a lot better. McGill University, which is like supposedly the Harvard of Canada, was a source of many of these lunatics. And you'll find that that's one of the hotbeds of hatred for anti-smoking. They would go in there, and that's where the term flame wars came from. Because people like that would come in there and they would just stir up all kinds of discord. They would call people names, just do everything they can. Because the people were talking about all these legitimate problems with the anti-smoking industry, the junk science, the lies, the fact that all these people suffering and dying from cancer didn't have to, but the anti-smokers were making sure that it happened because it benefited them to do so. So they would send all these trolls in there to stir up the pot. Same thing with student loans. Do you honestly think that somebody who went to college for 4 years or whatever, paid off their loans, they work as an accountant or a police officer or a teacher or whatever, that they're going to spend years going into trolling all of these places online where people are talking about student loan racketeering, and they're just going to sit there and insult everybody? Do you really think there are some insane people in this country? Make no mistake about it. Do you really think that's going to happen? I'll give you what I think happened. I think this industry hired people to go out and do just that. Because what it does is it creates discord in the unified group that someone like Alan was creating to fight against this. He was creating a huge army of people. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people who were starting to gather together and build power to stop this maniacal racket. And all these trolls would come in there and start calling people names, start accusing them of this and that. They even accused Collins of, I think, I don't know, threatening Al Lord or something like that. I don't know. That's what these people do. That started with anti-smoking. They were the first ones who did that. You see it now with climate change and everything else under the sun. Whenever people start to gather on the internet and they start to get some real power over a legitimate issue, they send in the trolls, the paid trolls. And it's harder to track them now, but back then it was easier with the anti-smokers. It was obvious who these people were. They have names. I know their names. You've heard their names on places like NPR, where they put on a completely different face. It is the exact same thing with the student loan industry. I wonder what John Boehner's daughter's job was at Sallie Mae. Because I kind of doubt she had to really perform all that well. Her father was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the third in line to the presidency of the United States. I kind of doubt her performance review was ever not good, even if she did absolutely nothing. Maybe she sat around all day in her office just trolling websites, insulting people who are suffering and dying because of the student loan racketeering. I don't know. I don't know. They were harder to trace then. I know with the anti-smokers, I know their names. And you know some of their names too. We'll talk about that later though, won't we? Student loan racketeering industry is a whole nother story. Al Lord made so much money from this in, I think it was within 4 years, he made $250 million. This is the CEO of a company that supposedly on paper services low interest, high risk loans. He made $250 million personally. The man built his own 18-hole golf course. You know why? He said it. He said it right in an interview. Because I don't like waiting. He doesn't want to wait behind the rabble to hit his little ball. So he's going to take all this land and he's going to turn it into an 18-hole golf course just for him and his buddies, so he doesn't have to wait. That's the kind of person you're talking about running the student loan industry. But he's not the only one. This is a criminal racket unlike anything the United States of America has ever seen. It has created a more than $1 trillion student loan bubble. You think the housing crisis was bad when that blew up in our faces? Wait till this one pops, baby. It has destroyed now multiple generations of, by definition, our most educated, motivated people. Many of our best people have moved out of the country. And it's not because they don't want to pay back their debts. I don't know really anybody. There's some irresponsible people out there. Everyone wants to pay back their debts. It makes you feel good. It makes you feel responsible. It makes you feel a sense of accomplishment. If you're going to go through all that effort to go through school to accomplish all these things, you're also going to want the accomplishment of paying off your student loans. But you know what? Sometimes life gets in the way, and you can't pay those back, especially when the student loan industry benefits more if you don't pay it back. Because what that means is this. This is from the review from Publishers Weekly. The author reveals that since lenders make far more money from defaulted loans than they do from borrowers in good standing, they go to extraordinary and illegal lengths to force borrowers into default. I figured this out on my own, from my own experience with student loans and from all that research I did on how information was being weaponized, in particular by the student loan industry as well. Alan went about it completely different. We crossed paths after we'd both been at this for years, and we came to the exact same conclusions through the very similar research. He has pushed for a legislative solution. I told him from the beginning that ain't gonna work, especially when the third in line to the presidency, his daughter works for Sallie Mae, and everyone in Washington knows, it's just common knowledge, Sallie Mae owns John Boehner, the third in line to the presidency. When Barack Obama came into office, what did he say? Did he say, we need to fix this problem? Because guess what? Mr. Collins here went and spoke to Barack Obama's staff and explained everything in this book to them as soon as he was elected to president. And yet, as soon as he became president, Barack Obama came out, and instead of saying a word, not even one word about this, he said, I got my education because of student loans. We need to make student loans more available to more students. Which is exactly what the student loan industry wants. Why? Because they make far more money from defaulted loans than they do from borrowers in good standing. So they go to extraordinary, even illegal lengths to force borrowers into default. It's so cold I can't even speak in this car. That's the student loan racketeering industry, folks. I'll tell you another piece of information that was not told to you by Care 11 or any news media in the United States. Sallie Mae, when George W. Bush took office the second time, his second inauguration, there were many individuals and entities who helped pay for his inaugural ball. One of them, I think there were 53 who contributed to that. One of them was Sallie Mae, and they gave him the maximum that they were allowed to, $250,000, $250,000 to help pay for George Bush's party, his inaugural ball. After that, when the housing crisis happened and the economy went, if you remember that, we seem to have short memories. That was what they called the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Do you remember that? Are you old enough to remember that? It was only about a decade ago, right? The worst financial crisis since the Great Depression under George Bush's watch. Then what did they do? What did he and John Boehner, his buddy, whose daughter works for Sallie Mae, what did they do? What did they do? Well, they were going to lose the elections, right? The Republicans were going to lose the elections because the economy had gone, and there's no better way to lose the election, whether it's your fault or not, and it wasn't really their fault. They were inheriting something that had happened years before that it takes that long. It's a lagging indicator. It takes that long to manifest itself. This goes back to the Clintons. And Bush. Bush made a lot of mistakes in his administration as well. But when that tanked, they needed to save themselves. So what did they do? Does anyone remember this lunacy? They came out with the government rebates, right? Every taxpayer, we will just give you free money. And then you're going to spend it, and it's going to get the blood, the cash flowing through the economy, and we're going to reinvigorate this economy. Oh, and because you like getting free money, you're probably going to vote for us too, because we're going to do this, shortly before the election. Yeah. At the time, I researched the daylights out of this. One of the things that everyone in any position of knowledge said, and I'm talking about John Boehner himself, Speaker of the House of Representatives, third in line to the presidency. I'm talking about the head of the Federal Reserve. I'm talking about major players in Washington. They all said the same thing. The only way, first they said this probably isn't going to do jack. Second of all, if it's going to do anything for the economy, it can only happen under a couple circumstances. A, these rebate checks must go to individuals. They can never, ever go to an organization, a group, a corporate entity. They must go to individual taxpayers. Number two, those taxpayers must spend them immediately. Everyone needs to do it at once. It's the only way. Well, guess what happens? Whenever the government gives you money, there's a couple reasons that they can take it away from you before they ever let you have it. One is, let's say, unpaid child support. If you're due a tax refund, government can take it. Never even enters your hand. In the private sector, student loans can do that. It violates the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, which says that it's unconstitutional for there to be involuntary servitude as punishment for a non-criminal offense. The failure to repay a debt is not a crime. It is a civil matter. And yet, what do? You are due your paycheck. Your paycheck's supposed to go to you, and then you pay your creditors, right? That's the way it's supposed to go. What they do is the check's on its way to you. They grab it, through something called garnishment, and then you might get a little bit of that back to feed your own family with. It does never end. The fruits of your labor never enters your hands. It's intercepted by a third party before it even gets to you. That's what violates the 13th Amendment of the Constitution. Student loans, if you're defaulted on student loans, you can kiss every government disbursement goodbye forever. Your tax, anything, your tax refunds, you'll never see them again. It will not reach you and then be taken away from you by a court under due process. It's just plain intercepted, and you have nothing to say about it in violation of the 13th Amendment. So when they did these rebates, since there were about 1 million, I think it was about 1 million defaulted student loan debtors in America, can you guess who the biggest beneficiary of those rebates was? Remember, all these high-powered players said the only way the rebates will have any impact on the economy, individuals receive the checks and they spend them immediately. And yet, about 1 million of those were intercepted by who? By Sallie Mae in particular, because they're the biggest company. The biggest beneficiary of that rebate was Sallie Mae. Again, my research is in storage, so I don't know the numbers anymore. I believe it was there was no way to find out because by then they had found ways to hide their documentation. You could no longer check their financial information like you could before. Why would they do that? Maybe because they're running a racket. I don't know. I'm just guessing. Seems plausible. But my estimation, it was somewhere between $14 and $20 billion that they received overnight. Those checks went out and they never got to the individual they were intended for. They got snagged by Sallie Mae or some other student loan company in violation of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America. Involuntary servitude, the fruits of your labor going to someone else without ever coming into your possession and being taken away by due process. It's just taken away while it's being delivered to you, the fruits of your labor. Or, in this case, a so-called rebate benefit. Now here's the trick. Since there's no regulation of this industry, no effective of any kind regulation of this industry, where do all these fees come from? I had an example here, if I can put it up. One woman, her student loans were transferred from one collection agency to another, and they charged a fee of more than $50,000 just to transfer it from one collection agency to another. $50,000. Well, guess what? If you get a rebate check for $300, all Sallie Mae has to do is the next day after those checks go out, you just have your people work overtime. They call up every one of those defaulted debtors. If they don't answer the phone, it doesn't matter because you tried to reach them, and you can charge a fee, and it's an arbitrary fee. You don't have to justify the amount because they go by what they call an industry standard. But they are the industry, so they set the standard. So let's say they want to charge $500 for that call. You just make the call. If the person's there, you terrorize them. If they say, I don't have any money, it's like, oh, whatever, all right. Call you tomorrow. We'll call your kids tomorrow. If they don't answer the phone, so what? You called, you documented that you called them. You can write down a $500 fee for that phone call, for that attempt to collect, as they call it. And the check's only for $300. So in other words, after that rebate check comes out on its way to you, you owe more money than you did before, while Sallie Mae is making billions of dollars and other student loan companies. Sallie Mae, let me remind you, paid $250,000 for the inaugural ball of George W. Bush. Do you see a pattern here? Do you see anything that might resemble, say, a criminal racket developing from this? Have you looked at the donors to Barack Obama, who was told all of this information? His staff was told in detail all this information, and then he comes right out and says, we need more student loans. Did you bother to look at who's donating money to Barack Obama's election campaign? I'll let you guess. Student loan industry has nothing whatsoever to do with education or making education available to students. On the one hand, the student loans have devastated education and our economy by the law of supply and demand. When they gave this so-called free money, or what appears to be free money, to bust that equilibrium, the tuition and books and all the support services, to administrative salaries, professor salaries, perks, all of this stuff skyrocketed. That's why education costs so much. And guess what? When you make this money available and people don't have to actually work for it, another thing happens in the education system. They no longer have to compete with each other. Because when you had equilibrium, only the best schools are what these people with their money wanted to spend their money on. They wanted to find the best school. But if the money's just free and it's just there, just here you go, free money, these schools no longer need to compete because there's money for everybody. And that's why the quality of our college education went straight down the toilet, correlating almost perfectly with the availability of student loans, which Mr. Obama wanted to make even more available. And I have only scratched the surface. I mean, just, here's my hand. Here's my hand. Can you even see what I just did there? I don't know if you can even see it. That's how much of this fraud I have talked about in 50 minutes. I urge you to visit studentloanjustice.org. I hope it still exists. To be honest, I'm in a car. I don't know. I think he moved it to Facebook so I could never watch it again because I don't do Facebook. Go read the stories, the horror stories. You're going to see another one of these episodes that concerns isolation, loneliness, despair, and trauma. This is one of the things I'm talking about. The student loan industry has destroyed lives. It's destroyed marriages. It's destroyed parent-child relationships. It's destroyed careers. The student loan industry, you can go to medical school, you can go to college for 8 years, 9, 10 years, residency, all that. Come out with, and if you don't pay it, they can take away your license to practice medicine, the very thing you spent a decade learning to do. The only thing that gives you any prayer of a chance of earning enough money to pay back the loans with, and the student loan industry can take away your license. And there isn't a single obligation whatsoever for the college student loan departments to tell a student that when they start that 10-year process of going through that education. No obligation to tell them whatsoever. Student loan racketeering industry, I mean, I don't even know how history's gonna, I don't know how history's even gonna try to describe what's happening here. What's happening here is corruption on a scale. The devastation caused by this is literally worse than if we got hit by several nuclear bombs. If nuclear bombs in 1970 had blown up Los Angeles and Chicago and New York and even Washington, nuclear bombs over the subsequent 50 years till today, the country would be better off if nothing had come in to give this free money for education, if the student loan industry hadn't existed. The country would be better off today if we'd been hit with nukes 50 years ago. Please, people, you need to know what's going on here. If all you're going to do is listen to the trolls who these people apparently seem to hire to go on the internet, and every time someone raises a legitimate issue like this, they go in there and say, "What's the matter? Are you a lazy bum? Aren't you going to pay your bills? I paid my student loans off." And they're going to try to dilute it, and they're going to try to blame the victim, which is another disgusting thing we'll see from time to time here. Happens often in rackets. Happened with my landlord. He blamed the victim. One reason I'm living in this car. After I went to college for all those years. Of course, for me it was a bit different. I recognized that college was a farce in terms of education almost right away. It took me several years to figure out what was really going on. But I didn't follow that path all the way through. I didn't want to, because the education itself, the product, remember, there was no more competition to provide the most excellent education. All this free money means that these guys can just go to the beach, because they're still getting paid. They don't have to compete with Harvard. They can now compete with Berkeley. Or some guy who sets up a table on a street corner to teach you physics. That's what they can compete with. Folks, I've scratched the surface. The rest is up to you. You can stick your head in the sand and ignore this problem, or you can realize that what we have here is an existential threat to the United States of America. What you do with that is up to you. But before you send your kids to college and you do anything other than earning the money to pay for that, I highly recommend that you do a little bit of responsible research. This and so many other resources. Because friends, no matter how hard they work, no matter how successful they are, they're not going to be allowed to go golfing on Al Lord's personal golf course that your kids paid for. Thank you for watching this video. I'll be back with existential threat number 6.